Today marks the end of the first week of the Derek Chauvin trial, who was the police officer involved in the George Floyd trial. This trial is noteworthy because it holds in line if other officers will be charged in the case, as well as the current state of affairs in terms of the BLM movement, police brutality, and other issues going on within the United States. Many states and cities are on alert as a result of the possibility that Derek Chauvin could be marked innocent, which would probably result in multiple BLM protests happening throughout the country. We do a deep dive into what's happened this first week of the trial, what we're expecting for results, and how the public is likely to result in act. Please like and subscribe if you're looking for daily news content, and let's dive on in. Starting us off from NPR, they give a summary on the day one events. Mr. Derek Chauvin betrayed this badge was one of the quotes. They include prone restraint is the central factor in the opening statements. And then the witness testify that there's something is wrong. So here are the several questions that they say will likely determine the outcome of the case. Do legal protections for police absolve Chauvin for responsibility for Floyd's death? Could it be considered reasonable for Chauvin to have used the amount of force he did? To what degree could other factors such as Floyd's recent drug use and his health have contributed to his death? If Chauvin is found to have directly caused Floyd's death, which of these three charges would the jurors agree upon? These are the questions that were really made up during the opening arguments, and these are likely to see what in the upcoming days what the questions that we will be see targeted towards the witnesses that are called. ABC News gives the key takeaways from the day two trial. Noteworthy witnesses included a firefighter who was not currently working, showed up, and we'll have some recording from her, as well as a MMA fighter, who, I'll be completely honest, I do not understand why we allowed an MMA fighter in this type of thing. He noteworthy says that Floyd used what's called a blood choke. There's two types of chokes, is the way I understand it. There's a blood choke, which the goal is to stop circulation, and then there's, I believe they're called bone chokes, or which are intended to actually like give lethal force or break someone's body down. From Star Tribune, we have a Wednesday summary. This includes a lot of individuals that are surrounding the Cup Foods, which was the location where George Floyd spent the fraudulent $20 bill. One was Christopher Martin, who was the Cups food clerk, and notably he said that he noticed that the bill was fake. He had the opportunity to not take the bill and said that he even quoted as saying, if I would have just not taken this bill, this could have all been avoided. Other witnesses include Christopher Belfry, who was picking up something to eat from that same Cup food, and Charles McMillian, who was the first witness on the scene after officers escorted Floyd across the street. And finally, Lieutenant James Rugal, who's the head of the Minneapolis Police Department Business Technology Unit. I'll just say that I don't think any of these witness testimonies will really be too influential on the outcome of the events, except for the first clerk, who did notably say that he said that George Floyd was a little shaky, which might point a little bit towards potential drug use assumptions. Finally, from the New York Times, they give a couple of live updates for Thursday, which is when I'm actually recording this, and here are their key updates. George Floyd was dead by the time medical help arrived, a paramedic testified. Lawyers for George Floyd's family say jurors should look past his drug use after hearing testimony about his addiction. George Floyd's girlfriend described their relationship a shared struggle with addiction, their first kiss, a dad selfie. Notably, the main actors on day four were the paramedics, as well as some family members around George Floyd, which is really just mainly focusing on his the background in the drug addiction, and how that could have potentially affected events around his death. So some notable recordings or actions that were done. We mentioned the firefighter on scene earlier. She was trying to essentially answer more than what jurors were asking, and had a stern talking to from the judge. We're going to be looking at that real quick.
We're outside the hearing of the jury. Ms. Hansen, I'm advising you, do not argue with counsel, and specifically, do not argue with the court.
Is the cameras off? Are the cameras off?
No, they're not. We're on the record.
Okay.
argue with the court. You will not argue with counsel. They have the right to ask questions. Your job is to answer them.
I was finishing my answer.
I will determine when your answer is done.
Okay, well,
And so, do not argue with the court. Do not argue with counsel. Answer the questions. Do not volunteer information that is not requested. The attorneys for the state have redirect. They can ask you questions if they think that certain things were left out.
okay.
It is counsel's prerogative to ask you leading questions and for you to answer those and not volunteer additional information.
Okay.
Are we clear on this?
We're clear.
Thank you. Come back tomorrow at 9:30.
All right. Good night.
Notably, this kind of just hits something that everyone should know if they're ever involved in trials. Just answer the questions you're asked. Both lawyers are trying to get the information out that they, want for their particular side. If one side thinks that you're letting out information for the other, they will question about it. And the judge does serve the job of making sure that the questions aren't, obtuse in terms of like the legal standing. Also, talking back to a judge isn't exactly your best line of defense for you personally. So coming from USA Today, there's a couple of things that were regarding the paramedic testimony. They mentioned they could have ended their restraint on George Floyd, which was a quote from the Chauvin trial, specifically mentioning that as soon as paramedics arrived, they could have, or as there was more police on site, they could have ended the force used by the police, which included the knee on the back of George Floyd. What I imagine to be the response from the defense, as they get to call witnesses, is they will look at the extended video recording, which will show that George Floyd was mentioning how he couldn't breathe and was being pretty sporadic before the knee was even on the back of George Floyd, which seems to make it that this testimony doesn't seem very relevant any longer, but that will be up to the jury. Finally, in the Derek Chauvin trial, George Floyd's girlfriend testifies. George Floyd's girlfriend testified in the Derek Chauvin trial Thursday, at times crying as she recounted the relationship. She said she was in a relationship with Floyd for 3 years. She tearfully described the first time they met. Ross said they started dating soon after that, and they would often walk around Bedemaka Ska in the Minneapolis Sculpture Gardens. Sorry for butchering it. They also frequently went out to eat. She said Floyd was a loving father and said it was hard for him to be away from his children who didn't live in Minnesota. She said Floyd was working security at a Latin restaurant and club, but was laid off due to the pandemic. She does, also go into the drug use. Both the prosecution and defense asked Ross about her and Floyd's drug use, which Ross said was a shared struggle. Ross said her and Floyd were both addicted to opioids and would take pills together. She said she suffered from chronic neck pain, and Floyd had pain in his back. Addiction is a lifelong struggle. It's something that we deal with every day. It's not something that just comes and goes, Ross said. It's something I'll deal with forever. Ross said her and Floyd took pills in March and May of 2020. They had different effect than most other pills they had taken. She said it was much more stimulating than others. Ross took Floyd to the hospital in March 2020 due to a drug overdose. He was hospitalized for 5 days and was doubled over in pain when Ross picked him up that night. Ross and Floyd at times bought drugs from Morris Hall, a man who was with Floyd when he was arrested. Ross said she didn't like Hall very much. This does, point out the potential there for being that the drugs had more of an impact than we've been led on, and might go into the sporadic behavior of George Floyd when he was being arrested. Finally, we're going to go into a bit of kind of like meta criminal discussions from the New York Post. What Derek Chauvin did to George Floyd was despicable, but unlikely to get a murder conviction. It's necessary to balance a revulsion for disgraced Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, an appalling case of police brutality, with recognition that prosecutors may have made a critical error by overcharging the case. This stipulated that the conduct of Chauvin, an armed instrument of the state, was repugnant and, yes, criminal. Casually kneeling on a handcuffed prone suspect's neck for 9 minutes does not meet the definition of proportional police use of force. No twisted, distorted interpretation of objective reasonableness codified as the means to judge law enforcement actions by the Supreme Court in Graham v. Connor charges that. Concluded the medical examiner concluded that the cause of death was homicide. However, the preliminary report suggested that underlying conditions may have contributed to Floyd's death. Specifically, they mentioned the toxicology report. The prosecutorial burden of proof in a murder case is an impossibly high threshold when saddled with the autopsy report listed in contributory factors in Floyd's death. Obviously, this is something that would be up to the jury to determine. Proving an applicable second-degree murder charge in Minnesota requires an intent to cause death, impossible to prove in this case. The definition of third-degree murder is murkier and plagued with conflicting interpretation. However, a person may be charged with second-degree manslaughter if they knowingly or consciously take a risk, like kneeling on someone's neck, that results in the death of a person. Chauvin conducted was manslaughter, culpable negligence. For those viewing as injustice anything less than a murder conviction, forewarned is forearmed. Notably, what they're kind of hinting at here is the potential for Derek Chauvin to be deemed innocent in this case, specifically that the murder charges might have been an overreach by the state. They could have, tried to go for lesser manslaughter charges. And that seems like a safer option. The real question in this type of things is, do we go with the more guaranteed, safer charge, or do you go for the riskier, heavier charge? It's a hard, question to ask. Unfortunately, our justice system doesn't really allow for, the double jeopardy to determine which of the two to charge for. And in my personal opinion, and this might just be my conservative leanings, that you should lean on the safer option than the harder option. We have coming from Spectator.us, justice for Derek Chauvin. If you were a juror, would you dare to return a not guilty verdict? Not that I think it's likely to come to that, as probably it's Scott John's report. At the behest of the mob, Governor Walz lifted responsibility for the prosecution from the office of the Hennepin County Attorney and assigned it to Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison. Take a moment to look up Keith Ellison, savior, his connections to the Nation of Islam and other radical groups. Then note that he has more than 130 lawyers in his employ for the trial of Derek Chauvin. Johnson observes Ellison has also tapped 4 prominent outside attorneys who have offered their services pro bono. On his side, Derek Chauvin has a local criminal defense lawyer that appears to be it. As Johnson dryly observes, if you're looking for Atticus Finch in the case, Nelson will have to serve. Nelson is the defense lawyer. So what will happen? Minnesota is endeavoring to prepare for any eventuality. The courthouse is beginning to look like Nancy Pelosi's Capitol, surrounded by metal fencing, concrete barriers, and razor wire. The local jailhouse has been fortified, and heightened security measures are being put in place around the city. So kind of 2 things that we want to hit here. First is just the absolute discrepancy when it comes to the legal I don't know what the word is. The degree of legal finances that are being used for the defense versus the state. Obviously, in our country, we allow the you're entitled to a lawyer for your defense, and obviously that's been provided in this case. But there's also a question of, like, is it necessarily fair to say that the state gets to use, they mentioned 130 lawyers plus I think it was four attorneys plus, the Keith Ellison. So you have 135 people there versus one, local lawyer. And, obviously facts don't really care about how many lawyers you have, but I would imagine that, having 135 people being able to jump through the different cases and legal standing throughout history is a little bit, better on your side than the one. And obviously this doesn't, defend anyone's personal actions, but just kind of shows how much of a discrepancy there is when it's the state versus someone individual. And then, this could even be taken to a further degree of, if you have something like the state versus some big company like Amazon, Walmart, etc., they have thousands of lawyers versus, the couple hundred from the state. It almost seems like the only fair way to do stuff like this is to make it a 1v1. But I don't know necessarily how to have that type of standing, and unfortunately I think the second aspect of why this matters, let's hypothetically say that Derek Chauvin is found innocent. I personally think it's leaning towards that, but that's just my biases based on the facts that I've been revealed at this time. They are talking about how there is essentially a setup of military military defenses being set up at this courthouse throughout the city. You can best believe that there will be protests and riots happening as a result if he's found innocent. And the only way that he's found innocent is if these 135 individuals lose to a single one. Right now Derek Chauvin has everything going against him in terms of finance. And if he's found innocent, I think that might speak more to the legal standing of the case rather than racism that's being spread everywhere. Finally, coming to the Philadelphia local CBS station, Philadelphia police finalizing plans for possibility of unrest amid Derek Chauvin trial. Minneapolis and other big cities around the country have security plans in place as Derek Chauvin's trial for the death of George Floyd plays out. In days following Floyd's death, unrest happened all across Philadelphia. There was warnings, but criticisms of the Philadelphia Police Department by top commanders said the department was not ready or prepared this time around. There is drafts in the work. This is just to show that there are cities outside of the Minnesota area that are prepping for the possibility of unrest. I think it's very likely that if Derek Chauvin is found innocent, that BLM, Antifa will, we'll see events like last summer. It's starting to warm up. Mask mandates are starting to be loosened. People are still cooped up with COVID-19, and this will be an excuse to go out, riot, protest, burn down cities. So I really, regardless of where you live, I would be prepared for that. Be prepared for cities to be on red alert when this trial ends. And this is your April 2nd Not So News update. Once again, please like and subscribe if you're looking for daily news content.